In the middle of the greatest desert on earth, a river flows. It has been flowing for millions of years, long before the first human hand touched its banks, long before the first boat crossed its surface, long before the first city rose on its shores. The Nile, 4,000 miles long, the longest river on earth, flowing north from the mountains of Central Africa, through Sudan, through Egypt, into the blue Mediterranean Sea. And in that journey, in the last few hundred miles, before it reaches the sea, it created something extraordinary. A strip of green, narrow, precise, impossibly lush, cutting through the Sahara Desert like a blade of grass, through stone. On one side of the river, life, rich black soil, date palms, fields of wheat and barley, birds and fish, and the smell of water in the heat. On the other side, 10 feet away, nothing. Sand, rock, silence, death. The ancient Egyptians had a word for their land, Kemet, the black land, named for the dark, fertile soil the Nile, left behind every year. When its floodwaters receded, everything that Egypt ever was, every pyramid and temple, every pharaoh and god, every painting and poem that survived 5,000 years, came from that black soil, from that river, from that impossible green strip, in the middle of the world's greatest desert. Every year, without fail, the Nile flooded. In July, the river rose, slowly at first, then faster, until the banks disappeared, and the fields became a shallow inland sea. The Egyptians watched this, not with fear, but with reverence, because when the waters finally receded in October, they left behind something more valuable than gold, a layer of rich black silt, carried all the way from the mountains of Ethiopia, deposited gently across the Egyptian fields, free fertilizer, every single year, without effort, without cost, while other ancient civilizations struggled to feed themselves, fighting thin soil and unreliable rainfall. Egypt simply waited. The river came, the river left. The crops grew, year after year, century after century, for 3,000 years. This is why Egypt lasted longer than any other civilization in human history. Not because its pharaohs were the wisest, not because its armies were the strongest, but because its river was the most reliable. When the Nile was generous, Egypt was powerful. When the Nile failed, even for a single year, the consequences were catastrophic. Famine, revolt, the collapse of dynasties, the entire fate of the most powerful civilization on earth rested on one river's annual decision to rise and fall. Before Egypt was Egypt, it was two lands. Upper Egypt in the south, a long narrow strip of river valley stretching from the first cataract to just below modern Cairo. Lower Egypt in the north, the wide green triangle of the Nile Delta, where the river fans out into dozens of channels before meeting the sea. Two kingdoms, two crowns, two gods, two completely different worlds, connected only by the river that ran between them. For centuries they existed, side by side, trading, fighting, watching each other across the water. And then, around 3100 BC, a king from the south, decided that was enough. His name was Narmer, or possibly Menes. The ancient sources disagree on the details, as ancient sources tend to do when the events in question happened 5,000 years ago. But what they agree on is this: one man, one war, one decision. And suddenly, for the first time in human history, Upper and Lower Egypt were one kingdom, one pharaoh, one crown that combined both the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north, the double crown, the crown that would sit on the heads of pharaohs. For the next 3,000 years, Egypt had begun. The first pharaohs built their capital at Memphis, a city at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, the perfect location for a king who ruled both. Memphis grew quickly. Within a few generations, it was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, a place of palaces and temples, of workshops and markets, of scribes recording everything. Because Egypt was perhaps the first civilization to truly understand the power of writing things down. The Egyptians wrote on papyrus, thin sheets made from the papyrus reed that grew abundantly along the Nile. Light, flexible, durable. They wrote in hieroglyphs, a writing system of extraordinary beauty, where pictures represented sounds and concepts in combinations that could express anything, from grain inventories to love poetry to the instructions for reaching the afterlife. The word hieroglyph means sacred carving, and sacred they were, carved into temple walls, painted on tomb ceilings, written on papyrus scrolls. For 3,000 years, Egypt wrote everything down. And because stone lasts, and because the dry desert air preserved what other climates would have destroyed, we can still read it. 5,000-year-old words, still legible, still meaningful, still reaching across the silence of all those centuries. To us, Egypt's history is divided into periods called kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, with intermediate periods between them, times of chaos and division, when the central authority collapsed and local rulers fought among themselves. But always, Egypt pulled itself back together, because the Nile kept flowing, because the soil kept feeding people, because the idea of Egypt, one land, one king, one ordered world, standing against the chaos beyond its borders, was too powerful to die. The Old Kingdom lasted from roughly 2686 to 2181 BC, 500 years. This was the age of the pyramid builders, the age when Egypt looked at the desert horizon and decided, we will build something so large, so permanent, so impossible to ignore, that it will still be standing when every other monument humanity has ever raised has turned to dust. They were right. The pyramids of Giza are the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing, built 4,500 years ago. Still there. Still the largest stone structures ever built by human hands. Still making people stop. Still making people look up. Still making people ask, how? The Nile gave Egypt its calendar too. 3 seasons. Okay, the flooding season, when the river rose and the fields disappeared beneath brown water, when farmers left their land and came to work for the pharaoh. Building temples, digging canals, constructing the monuments that would outlast everyone. Parade, the growing season, when the waters receded and the black soil emerged, when the seeds went in and the fields turned green, almost overnight, when Egypt held its breath and watched the crops grow. Shema, the harvest season, when the wheat and barley stood tall in the fields, when the whole country bent its back to the work of gathering everything the river had made possible. Then okay again, year after year, the same rhythm, as reliable as breathing. Egyptian life was organized entirely around this cycle. Their religion reflected it. Their art reflected it. Their architecture was aligned to the movements of sun and star that marked its turning points. They were, in the deepest sense, a civilization in harmony with the natural world that sustained them, not fighting the desert, not trying to conquer nature, simply watching, simply listening, simply moving with the rhythm the river gave them, and building within that rhythm something eternal. What made Egypt different from every other ancient civilization? Many things, but perhaps most of all, its relationship with time. Egyptians thought about time differently than we do. We think of time as linear, a line moving from past through present to future, always forward, never returning. Egyptians thought of time as cyclical, like the Nile flood, like the sun rising and setting, like the stars returning to the same positions each year. Time, for Egyptians, was not an arrow, it was a wheel, and this changed everything. If time was cyclical, if the sun would always rise again, if the Nile would always flood again, if the dead could be reborn, just as the grain was reborn, each growing season, then death was not an ending, it was a transition, a turning of the wheel. The pharaoh who died was not gone. He had become Osiris, god of the dead, ruler of the afterlife. His son, the new pharaoh, was Horus, the living embodiment of divine kingship. Life becoming death, becoming life again, the wheel turning forever. This was not superstition. This was the deepest truth. The Egyptians knew that nothing truly ends, that the river always returns, that the sun always rises, that the story goes on. 3,000 years. Let that number sit for a moment. 3,000 years. From Narmer uniting the two lands, around 3100 BC, to Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, dying in 30 BC, Egypt endured for 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, the Roman Empire, at its height, lasted 500 years. The British Empire, perhaps 300. The United States of America has existed for less than 250 years. Egypt lasted 3,000, 12 times longer than. The United States has existed 6 times longer than the Roman Empire. The same civilization, the same language, the same gods, the same pharaoh-based system, for 3,000 years. How? The Nile. Always the Nile. When the river gave, Egypt was invincible. A civilization so stable, so well-fed, so confident in its own permanence, that it could afford to think about things other than survival, about beauty, about knowledge, about the stars, about death, about what comes after, about eternity. And in thinking about eternity, it nearly achieved it. The ancient Egyptians called their country Tamari, the beloved land. Not the powerful land, not the eternal land, not the great land, the beloved land. There is something quietly moving about that name. These were people who built the largest stone structures on earth, who developed one of the earliest writing systems, who produced art of extraordinary sophistication, who understood astronomy, medicine, mathematics, engineering, at a level that still astonishes modern scholars. And what they called their country was beloved, because of the river, because of the black soil, because of the green strip in the desert, because of the life that was possible there, and nowhere else for hundreds of miles in any direction. They loved their land, the way you love something that keeps you alive, with the deep, quiet, undemonstrative love of someone who knows that without this, there is nothing. The Nile gave them everything, and they knew it, and they built their entire civilization as an act of gratitude. Every temple, every pyramid, every hieroglyph carved into stone, an offering to the river, to the sun, to the forces that made life possible in the middle of the desert. A thank you that lasted 3,000 years and still stands today. The Nile still flows through the same valley, past the same desert, under the same stars. The pyramids still stand on its western bank, as they have stood for 4,500 years. The same sun still rises each morning over the eastern desert and falls each evening behind the western cliffs. Tourists come now, where pharaohs once walked. They stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and look up and feel the same thing every human being has felt, standing there for 4,000 years. Smallness, the pleasant, humbling smallness of a creature whose life is measured in decades, standing before something built for eternity. The ancient Egyptians wanted to be remembered. They carved their names into stone for that reason. They built monuments for that reason. They preserved their dead with extraordinary care. For that reason, they are remembered more completely, more intimately, more personally than almost any other ancient people. We know their names. We can read their words. We can look at their faces, preserved in paint and stone, and recognize something human, something familiar, something that says, we were here. We loved this river. We built something that would last. And it did. It does. It will. The Nile flows on tonight, as it has for millions of years, carrying its dark water north to the sea, carrying the memory of everything that grew on its banks. The first farmers, watching the flood waters rise, the scribes bending over their papyrus in the lamplight, the pharaohs standing at the prow of their golden barges, the workers cutting stone in the desert heat, the priests chanting in the incense-heavy dark of temple sanctuaries. All of them gone now, all of them remembered, all of them part of the long story of this river and this land and this civilization that refused to be ordinary, that looked at the desert and saw possibility, that looked at death and saw a door, that looked at stone and saw eternity. Sleep now. Let the Nile carry you gently northward through the dark. The story of Egypt is just beginning. In every civilization that has ever existed, someone has stood at the top. A king, a chief, an emperor, a president, a warlord. But no ruler in human history occupied a position quite like the Egyptian pharaoh. Not just a king, not just a conqueror, a god, living, breathing, walking among ordinary human beings. But not one of them. Something more. Something between the human world and the divine one. The bridge between the people of Egypt and the forces that controlled the universe. The son of Ari, the sun god, the living embodiment of Horus, falcon-headed god of kingship, and upon death, Osiris himself, ruler of the dead, judge of souls, for 3,000 years. This was not mythology. This was not poetry. This was the literal, understood, unquestioned truth of Egyptian civilization. The pharaoh was a god, and everything, every temple, every law, every military campaign, every grain of wheat, harvested from the black soil, existed to serve and support that god's presence on earth. The word pharaoh comes from the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, the great house. Originally it referred not to the king himself, but to the royal palace. Over centuries, the term shifted. The great house became synonymous with the person who lived in it, the pharaoh. And what a person that was! From the moment of his coronation, a ceremony of extraordinary complexity, lasting days involving priests and rituals and offerings that transformed an ordinary human being into a living deity. The pharaoh existed in a different category than everyone else. He wore the double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. He carried the crook and flail, symbols of his role as shepherd and provider of his people. He wore the false beard, a ritual object, not a real beard, tied to his chin with a strap. Even female pharaohs wore it in official portraits, because the false beard was not about gender, it was about divinity. Every god in the Egyptian pantheon was depicted with that beard, to where it was to say, I am not entirely human, I stand with the gods. The first great pharaoh, whose name history remembers clearly, is Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. We know almost nothing personal about him. The largest structure ever built by human hands, containing 2.5 million stone blocks, weighing an average of 2.5 tons each, was built for this man, for his afterlife, for his eternity. And yet we have almost no record of what he was like as a person. What we have is the pyramid, which perhaps says everything that needs to be said. A man so convinced of his own divine status, so certain of his own eternity, that he was willing to organize the labor of an entire nation for 20 years to build himself a tomb, not a monument to his victories, not a temple to his god, a tomb, because death for Khufu was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of the part that mattered, the eternal part, the part that would last long after every army he had ever commanded, every enemy he had ever defeated, every word he had ever spoken had turned to silence and dust. The pyramid would remain, and it did. 4,500 years later, it remains. Not all pharaohs were men. This surprises people. In a civilization where women had more rights than almost anywhere else, in the ancient world, where they could own property, run businesses, divorce their husbands, appear in court on their own behalf, a woman could, under the right circumstances, become pharaoh. The most remarkable of these was Hatshepsut. She came to power around 1473 BC, initially as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III. Then she did something extraordinary. She stopped being regent and became pharaoh, full pharaoh, wearing the double crown, wearing the false beard, depicted in official art as a male king, because the role of pharaoh was officially a male role, while simultaneously being completely known to be a woman. Egypt accepted this without apparent crisis, because Hatshepsut was extraordinary at the job. She sent trading expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt, returning with myrrh trees, exotic animals, gold and ivory. She built her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, one of the most beautiful buildings in the ancient world, carved directly into the cliff face above the Nile. She ruled for 20 years, and Egypt prospered. After her death, her stepson Thutmose III, finally pharaoh in his own right, had her images erased from official monuments, tried to remove her from history, failed completely, because stone is more patient than anger, and Hatshepsut's temple still stands. Around 1353 BC, a pharaoh came to the throne who would shake Egypt to its foundations. His name at birth was Amenhotep IV. He changed it to Akhenaten, servant of the Aten, and then he did something that no pharaoh before him had ever done, something so radical, so unprecedented, so deeply shocking to Egyptian civilization that they tried to erase his memory completely. After his death, he closed the temples, all of them, the temples of Ammonius, of Ra, of Osiris, of every god in the vast Egyptian pantheon, closed. The priests dismissed. The offerings stopped. The rituals ended. Because Akhenaten had decided there was only one god, the Aten, the disk of the sun, the physical light that fell each morning on the fields of Egypt, not a god with a human form, and human stories and human jealousies, just light, pure, impersonal, universal light. It was, in some ways, one of the earliest experiments in monotheism, the worship of a single god, in recorded history. It lasted 17 years. Then Akhenaten died, and Egypt returned to its old gods, with the relief of a person returning home after a very long and very strange journey. The temples reopened, the priests returned, the offerings resumed, and Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, was written out of history, or so they thought. The desert preserved his city, and 3,000 years later, archaeologists found it, and found him, waiting in the sand, patient as stone, patient as the sun he had worshipped. Akhenaten's son inherited a broken kingdom. He was 9 years old. His name, when he came to the throne, reflected his father's religion. Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, his advisors quickly changed it. Tutankhamen, living image of Ammonius, the old god restored. The heresy officially ended. The boy king, made the symbol of Egypt's return to tradition. He ruled for 9 years. Died at 18 or 19. The cause still debated by modern scientists. A broken leg, malaria, the complications of being born into a family that had married its own relatives too many times. In the name of divine bloodlines, he was, by the standards of Egyptian history, a minor pharaoh, forgotten within a generation, his tomb sealed, his name buried under later construction. For 3,000 years, nobody was looking for him. Then, in November 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter found a step cut into the bedrock of the Valley of the Kings, and then another step, and another, and a sealed door. And behind that door, the most spectacular archaeological discovery in human history, the intact tomb of Tutankhamun, untouched for 3,000 years, still glittering, still golden, still perfect. A boy king forgotten for 30 centuries, who became the most famous pharaoh in the world. The moment his tomb was opened, history has a sense of irony. The greatest warrior pharaoh in Egyptian history was Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. He ruled for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BC, longer than almost any monarch in human history. He was perhaps 25 when he came to the throne. He was 90 approximately when he died. In those 66 years, he fought battles, built temples, fathered children, and carved his name into more stone than any other pharaoh before or after him. His most famous battle was at Kadesh against the Hittites in what is now Syria. Around 1274 BC, the battle ended, essentially, in a draw, but Ramesses commissioned the most extensive propaganda campaign in ancient history, covering the walls of every major temple in Egypt with his version of events. In Ramesses' version, he won spectacularly, heroically, almost single-handedly. The reality was more complicated, but the walls said what Ramesses wanted them to say, and for 3,000 years. That is what people read. Perhaps the first lesson in the history of political spin. He who controls the walls controls the story. Ramesses built everywhere. The temples of Abu Simbel, carved directly into the cliffs of Nubia, with 4 colossal statues of himself, each 20 meters high, sitting guard at the entrance. The Ramesseum, his mortuary temple at Thebes, additions to Karnak, the greatest temple complex ever built by human hands. He put his name on everything he built, and on many things he didn't build, simply carving his cartouche over earlier pharaohs' names, an ancient form of taking credit for other people's work. He had over 100 children from his many wives and concubines. His favorite wife was Nefertari, for whom he built the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Queens. The paintings on its walls are considered the finest examples of ancient Egyptian art in existence. Every color still vivid, every figure still graceful. A love letter in paint to a woman dead 3,000 years. Still beautiful, still there. Ramesses outlived most of his children. He was still pharaoh, in his 90s, ancient beyond ancient. His body worn down, by decades of campaigning, and building and ruling, but still Pharaoh, still the living God, because a God does not simply resign, a God endures until the last breath, and then becomes something else entirely. What happened when a pharaoh died? Egypt held its breath. The death of a pharaoh was not merely a political event. The death of a king, to be replaced by another. It was a cosmic event. The God who walked among men was returning to the divine realm. The sun, some ancient texts suggest, grew dimmer when a pharaoh died. The Nile hesitated. The world itself paused, uncertain for a moment whether the great cycle would continue. Would the sun rise tomorrow? Would the river flood again? Would the crops grow? Only the successful completion of the burial rituals could ensure this. 70 days. That was how long the mummification process took. 70 days of ritual preparation. Removing the organs, treating the body with natron salt, wrapping in linen, placing in nested coffins, while priests chanted, and offerings were made, and the entire country officially mourned. 70 days between the death of one god and the coronation of another. 70 days of cosmic uncertainty. And then, the new pharaoh crowned, the wheel turning, the sun confirmed in its rising, the river reassured of its flooding, Egypt breathing again. The pharaohs of Egypt are not gone, not entirely. Their faces look out from museum walls across the world, in Cairo, in London, in Paris, in New York. Stone faces, painted faces, golden masks, all of them with that particular Egyptian expression. Calm, remote, eternal. The expression of someone who has already accepted that time means nothing, that what matters is not the length of a life, but what is left behind. Khufu left a pyramid. Hatshepsut left a temple carved into a cliff. Akhenaten left a revolution that failed, and a son whose golden mask became the most recognized face in the ancient world. Ramesses left his name on more stone than any human being in history. None of them planned to be remembered the way they are. Khufu didn't imagine tourists. Hatshepsut didn't imagine archaeologists reassembling her smashed statues. Tutankhamun didn't imagine anything. He was 9 years old and probably more interested in chariot racing. But here they are, still being talked about, still being argued about, still fascinating people who live in a world they could not have. Imagine, 5,000 years later, the gods among men, still in their way, among us. The pharaohs sleep now, in their tombs cut into the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, in their pyramids, standing against the desert horizon, in the museums, where their mummies lie in climate-controlled cases, still wrapped, still preserved, still waiting for something that will never come, or perhaps, in the Egyptian understanding of time and eternity, waiting for something that has already arrived and will arrive again. The wheel turns, the sun rises, the Nile flows, and the gods among men rest, as we rest now, in the long, deep, eternal dark, between one day and the next. The story of Egypt continues tomorrow. There is a moment when you stand at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, when your brain simply refuses to process what your eyes are seeing. The numbers are known. You can read them in any book. 2.5 million stone blocks. Average weight 2.5 tons each. Some blocks weighing 80 tons. Height 146 meters. Base 230 meters on each side. You can know all of this, and still, standing at its base, looking up at the angle of stone, rising into the Egyptian sky, the mind goes quiet, because no number prepares you for the reality. For 4,000 years, from its completion, around 2560 BC, to the construction of the Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311 AD, the Great Pyramid was the tallest structure on Earth, the tallest thing human beings had ever built for 4,000 years. And it was built not with cranes or computers or steel, but with human hands, with copper tools, with rope and wood, and an organizational genius that still makes modern engineers pause. How? The first thing to understand about the pyramid builders is that they were not slaves. This is perhaps the most persistent myth about the pyramids, fed by centuries of imagination and a famous scene in the Book of Exodus. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. The workers who built the Great Pyramid were Egyptian citizens, paid workers. We know this because archaeologists found their village in the 1990s. Excavations near Giza uncovered the settlement where the pyramid builders lived, and what they found surprised everyone. These were not the hovels of slaves. The workers ate well: beef, bread, fish, beer. Better, in fact, than many ordinary Egyptians. They had their own bakeries, their own breweries, their own medical facilities. Archaeologists found evidence of sophisticated medical care, including healed bone fractures, that suggest workers received treatment after injuries. On the construction site, they had their own tombs, small but real tombs, built near the pyramid, an honor that only free men received. They left graffiti, work gang graffiti, painted on stone blocks. In the heart of the pyramid, names of work gangs that translated to things like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. People have been writing things on walls at their workplace for 4,000 years. Some things never change. How many workers? Modern estimates suggest around 20 to 30,000 people worked on the Great Pyramid at any given time, not all at once in the same place. The construction was organized in rotating teams, with workers coming from across Egypt in shifts of perhaps 3 months at a time. While one team worked, another rested. Another was traveling to or from the site. The logistics alone: feeding, housing, managing, coordinating 20,000 people in the desert far from the main Nile settlements were a feat of organization, as impressive in their way as the pyramid itself. Egypt had no modern management theory, no spreadsheets, no project management software. They had papyrus. They had scribes. They had an administrative system that had been refined over centuries. And they had something more powerful than any management tool: belief. The workers believed they were building something sacred, something that would ensure their pharaohs safe passage to eternity, and through that, ensure Egypt's continued existence under the gods. They were not building a tomb, they were building the universe's guarantee that tomorrow would come. That is a powerful motivation for any worker. The engineering of the pyramids is still not fully understood, and that is not false mystery. That is the honest admission of modern engineers and archaeologists who have spent careers studying these structures. We know the basic methods. Stone was quarried nearby. The limestone casing blocks from the Tura quarries across the Nile. The granite inner chambers from Aswan, 800 kilometers to the south. The granite was transported by boat down the Nile. The limestone was moved on wooden sledges, dragged across moistened sand, which reduces friction dramatically. As experiments have shown, ramps of some kind were certainly used to raise the blocks. But what kind of ramps? A straight ramp rising to the pyramid's full height would have required more material than the pyramid itself. Internal ramps? Spiral ramps? Some combination? The debate continues. What we know for certain is the result. 2.5 million blocks, fitted together with such precision that a sheet of paper cannot be inserted between many of them. The base of the Great Pyramid is leveled to within just 2 centimeters across its entire 230-meter width. 2 centimeters, with no laser levels, no GPS, no modern surveying equipment, just stars and water, and extraordinary skill. Inside the Great Pyramid, the air is cool and still, has been cool and still for 4,000 years. The Grand Gallery, a corbelled passage, rising steeply toward the King's Chamber, is one of the most extraordinary interior spaces in the ancient world. 8.5 meters high, 47 meters long, its walls rising in overlapping layers of stone that create a pointed vault of extraordinary stability. At the end of the gallery, the King's Chamber, a room of red Aswan granite, entirely of granite, walls, floor, ceiling, 43 granite beams, each weighing 54 tons, make up the ceiling. Above the chamber, 5 compartments of stone, one above the other, designed to distribute the enormous weight of 2.5 million blocks above it, away from the chamber below. An engineering solution of elegant sophistication, designed by someone who understood structural loads 4,500 years before the first engineering school. In the center of the chamber, a lidless granite sarcophagus, empty, whatever was in it. The pharaoh's mummy, his treasures, the grave goods, meant to sustain him through eternity, was removed by tomb robbers thousands of years ago. Only the sarcophagus remains, too large to move, too heavy to steal, sitting in the dark, in the heart of the largest stone structure on earth, waiting. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was not the first pyramid. It was the perfection of an idea that had been developing for generations. The first pyramid was built about a century earlier for the pharaoh Djoser, designed by his architect, a man named Imhotep. Imhotep was extraordinary, Not just an architect, though his step pyramid at Saqqara was revolutionary, but a physician, a writer, a priest, a philosopher. So remarkable was he, in so many fields, that after his death, Egyptians eventually deified him, made him a god, one of the very few non-royal humans in Egyptian history to receive divine honors. His step pyramid rose in 6 levels, each level a mastaba, the flat-top tomb structure that Egyptian nobility had been building for generations, stacked one on top of another, each one smaller than the last. A revolutionary idea, not a flat tomb, a staircase to heaven, so the pharaoh's soul could climb from the earthly world to the divine one. From this simple idea, a staircase in stone, the Great Pyramid followed. Imhotep's step became a smooth slope. The mastabas became the greatest structure humanity had ever built, all from one architect's revolutionary thought. What if we built upward? The pyramids were not built in isolation. They were the centerpiece of enormous temple complexes, valley temples at the edge of the Nile, connected by causeways to mortuary temples against the pyramid's base, where priests would perform rituals for the dead pharaoh's spirit. For generations after his death, the great Sphinx crouches at the edge of the complex, a human head on a lion's body, 73 meters long, 20 meters high, carved from a single outcropping of bedrock that the pyramid builders found on the plateau and decided to use. The face is traditionally said to be Khafre, builder of the second pyramid, though this is debated. The Sphinx has been buried in sand for most of its existence, the desert reclaiming it again and again, and excavated repeatedly by rulers and archaeologists who could not leave it to disappear. It gazes east toward the rising sun, has been gazing east for 4,500 years, patient, watchful, unmoved by everything that has happened in that time, every empire that rose and fell, every army that marched past it, every century that came and went. The Sphinx watched and said nothing and remained. When the Great Pyramid was first completed, it looked nothing like what we see today. The rough, stepped appearance of the pyramids today, the exposed core blocks, each one a convenient foothold for modern climbers, was never meant to be seen. The original pyramid was cased in white Tura limestone, polished, gleaming in the Egyptian sun. The Great Pyramid would have been visible from hundreds of miles away, a blinding white mountain rising from the desert, its gold-capped apex catching the first and last light of each day. Imagine seeing it for the first time, traveling toward Giza, along the Nile, knowing nothing of what was waiting, and then, there on the horizon, something that your eyes told you could not exist. A perfect white mountain, man-made, geometrically precise, rising from flat desert to an impossible height, gleaming like a star that had landed in the sand. The casing stones are gone now, stripped over centuries by later builders who used them for mosques and palaces and other buildings. In Cairo and beyond, only a few remain, At the base of Khufu's pyramid, just enough to show what it once was, what all three pyramids once were. Three white mountains, visible from space. Some say, certainly visible from every direction on Earth. For 100 miles, the statement of a civilization that had decided, we will be seen, we will be known, we will be remembered. The pyramids still hold secrets. In 2017, using a technique called muon tomography, which uses cosmic ray particles to see through solid stone, the way X-rays see through flesh, scientists discovered a previously unknown void inside the Great Pyramid, 30 meters long, located above the Grand Gallery. What it is? A construction void, an undiscovered chamber, something else entirely. Nobody knows. Nobody has been inside, because getting inside, without damaging the pyramid is extraordinarily difficult. So it sits there, a secret that the Great Pyramid has kept for 4,500 years, still keeping it. This is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the pyramids. Not that we know so much about them, but that after centuries of study, after generations of archaeologists and engineers and historians have devoted their careers to these structures, the pyramids still have things they haven't told us, still have rooms we haven't seen, still have questions we can't answer. How exactly were they built? What is the void inside the Great Pyramid? Why were some pyramid shafts aligned to specific stars? What happened to Khufu's mummy? The pyramids look back at all our questions and say nothing, patient, as they have always been, as they will always be. Every year, millions of people come to Giza. They come from every country, every culture, every background. They arrive expecting to be impressed, and they are. But what surprises most of them, what nobody quite prepares them for, is the feeling. Not awe exactly, though there is awe. Not smallness exactly, though there is that too. Something harder to name, a sense of connection to the workers who dragged those stones across the sand, to the scribes who recorded every block, to the architect who looked at this plateau and saw what could be here, to the pharaoh who looked at his own mortality and decided to answer it with 2.5 million stones. We are not so different from the people who built this thing. We have the same fears, the same desire to matter, the same need to leave something behind, to say, I was here, I existed, I built something. The pyramid is the loudest, largest, most permanent version of something every human being has ever felt. The need to be remembered. And standing at its base, looking up at 4,000 years of stone and silence, you feel it too. You are part of the same story. We all are. The sun sets behind the pyramids, as it has set behind them 4,000 years. The sky turns orange, then red, then the deep purple of an Egyptian night. The stars come out, the same stars the pyramid builders navigated by, the same stars that aligned with the pyramid shafts, the same stars that Khufu looked up at, if he ever looked up, and decided needed a monument beneath them, worthy of their permanence. The pyramids darken, become silhouettes, become shapes against the stars, 4,500 years of sunsets have done this. 4,500 years of nights have passed over these stones, and still they stand. Still they wait. Still they hold their secrets. In the dark, as we hold ours. As the night holds all of us. Gently. In the dark. Between one day and the next. Where sleep lives. Where the dead wait. For the sun to rise again. Where we all rest. Before the morning comes. In the beginning. There was nothing. No earth. No sky. No light. No dark. Just water. An infinite, silent, motionless ocean. Stretching in every direction. Without boundary or end. The Egyptians called it none. The primordial waters. The void before creation. And then, something moved. From the depths of none. A mound of earth rose. The first land. The first solid thing. In an infinite sea of nothing. And on that mound, a god opened his eyes. His name was Adam. The complete one. He had always existed. Somehow. Within the formless water. Waiting for the moment. When existence itself was ready to begin. And now it was ready. Adam stood on the first mound of earth. In the middle of the infinite nothing. And created everything. From himself. Through his own will. Through the power of his own existence. He spoke the names of things. And the things came into being. Air. Moisture. Earth. Sky. Light. Dark. Life. Death. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was Egyptian. The Egyptian gods were not distant, abstract forces. They were personal, complicated, often contradictory. They had families. They had rivalries. They made mistakes. They felt grief and love, and jealousy and joy. Like anyone, like everyone, the Egyptians did not expect their gods to be perfect. They expected them to be powerful and present. The greatest of all Egyptian gods was Ra, the sun god. Not a god who commanded the sun. Not a god who made the sun shine. Ra was the sun. Every morning Ra sailed his golden bark across the sky from east to west, bringing light and warmth and life to the world below. Every evening he descended below the western horizon and sailed through the underworld, the Duat, through 12 hours of darkness, battling the chaos serpent Apophis, who tried, every single night, to swallow the sun and end the world. Every single night, Ra fought that battle, and every morning, he won. The sunrise was not natural. It was a victory. The sun did not simply rise. Ra had survived another night in the underworld, had fought the chaos, had defeated the darkness, and was rising again to give Egypt another day. Every sunrise, a miracle. Every dawn, a gift. The most beloved story in Egyptian mythology, the one that explained death and resurrection, darkness and light, chaos and order, was the story of Osiris. Osiris was the first pharaoh, the perfect king. He taught humanity civilization, agriculture, law, religion. He ruled with wisdom and justice. His wife was Isis, goddess of magic, of healing, of protection, the most powerful goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. Together they were the ideal royal couple, wise king, powerful queen, and then his brother killed him. Set, god of chaos, storms, and the desert. Set murdered his brother Osiris. The stories vary on the details. Some say he trapped him in a coffin and threw it in the Nile. Some say he cut the body into 14 pieces and scattered them across Egypt. But the meaning is always the same. Chaos killed order. Death killed life. And the world waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was Isis. She searched for her husband across all of Egypt. Piece by piece, she gathered what had been scattered, used her magic, the greatest magic in creation, to reassemble what had been destroyed. And then she did something no one had ever done before. She brought him back. Not to life, exactly. The world of the living was no longer Osiris's place, but to existence, to the afterlife. She transformed him, through her magic and her love, into the ruler of the dead, lord of the underworld, judge of souls, king of eternity. Osiris did not lose. He was transformed. Death was not an ending. It was a transformation. And from this transformation, from this story of murder and grief and magical resurrection, Egypt built its entire understanding of what happens after we die. The dead do not disappear. They go to Osiris. They are judged. They are weighed. They are found worthy, or not. And those who are worthy live forever in the field of reeds, the Egyptian afterlife. A perfect version of Egypt, where the Nile always floods, the crops always grow, and life continues, without the suffering that shadows it here. Death was a door. Osiris stood on the other side, waiting. But Isis was not finished. Before Osiris descended to rule the dead, she had conceived a son, Horus, the falcon-headed god, god of the sky and kingship, the living embodiment of divine rule on earth. She raised him in secret, hidden from Set in the marshes of the Nile Delta, raised him to know what had been taken, raised him to reclaim it. When Horus came of age, he challenged his uncle Set for the throne of Egypt. The battle lasted, depending on which version you read, 80 years. 80 years of conflict between order and chaos, between the legitimate heir and the usurper, between the principles of civilization and the forces that would destroy it. In the end, the gods judged in favor of Horus. Set was exiled, or defeated, or, in some versions, pardoned and given a different role. Because even chaos has its place in the universe. And Horus took the throne, became pharaoh, and every pharaoh after him, every human king who sat on Egypt's throne, was Horus, the living god, the son of Osiris, the child Isis had protected in the marshes. The story was not mythology. It was the operating manual for Egyptian civilization. Anubis, the god with the head of a jackal, god of embalming, god of the dead, guardian of the scales of judgment. He appears in every Egyptian tomb painting, his black jackal head and human body presiding over the most important moment in any Egyptian's life, the moment after death, when the heart was weighed. In the Hall of Two Truths, a great ceremonial chamber in the afterlife, Anubis placed the dead person's heart on one side of a scale, on the other side, a single feather, the feather of Maat, goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. If the heart was light, free of sin, free of cruelty, free of dishonesty, it balanced the feather, and the soul passed to eternal life. If the heart was heavy, weighted down by a life of wrongdoing, it did not balance, and a creature waited beside the scales. Ambient, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, she ate the heart, and the soul ceased to exist. No punishment, no hell, simply nothing. The worst fate the Egyptians could imagine was not suffering, it was erasure, to be forgotten completely, which is why they carved their names in stone, why they built monuments, why they preserved their bodies, because as long as your name was spoken, as long as someone remembered you, you still existed, somewhere, in some form. The heart balanced the feather, and you lived. Thoth, the god with the head of an ibis, or sometimes a baboon, god of writing, wisdom, magic, the moon, and time, he stood in the hall of two truths beside Anubis, recording the results of the judgment on his papyrus scroll, the divine scribe. But Thoth was more than a record keeper. He was the inventor of writing, the god who gave language to humanity, who taught the scribes their art, who recorded everything, the movements of stars, the words of the gods, the history of creation, in a great library, in the divine realm, that contained all knowledge that ever was or ever would be. The Egyptians had a deep reverence for scribes, for the men who could read and write in a world where most could not, and this reverence came from their mythology. Writing was not a human invention, it was a gift from a god. The marks on papyrus, the hieroglyphs carved in stone, were sacred, each one a small piece of divine power, made accessible to human hands. To write was to touch the divine, to read was to hear the gods speak, which perhaps explains why the Egyptians wrote so much, and why so much of it survived. Sacred things are worth preserving. Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, music, dance, and joy. She is depicted as a cow, or as a woman with cow's horns and a sun disk between them. The Egyptians did not find this strange. The cow was the gentlest, most nurturing animal they knew, the animal that gave milk, that fed children, that was patient and warm, and endlessly giving. What better form for the goddess of love? Hathor's temples were places of music and celebration. Her priests danced. Her rituals involved wine and song. She was the opposite of the severe, distant god of some religious traditions. She was joy, embodied, deified, worshipped, because the Egyptians understood something that more austere religions sometimes forgot. That beauty matters, that music matters, that laughter and dance, and the pleasures of being alive are not distractions from the spiritual life. They are part of it. Hathor was not a lesser god. She was as essential as Ra and Osiris, because a civilization that does not celebrate, that does not sing, that does not make art, is not really alive. It is merely surviving. And Egypt was not interested in merely surviving. Egypt wanted to live fully, joyfully, with music in the temples, and wine at the feasts, and Hathor watching over all of it, pleased. Set is often called the villain of Egyptian mythology, the murderer of Osiris, the god of chaos and storms. But Set was more complicated than that, because chaos is not always the enemy. The Egyptians understood this. Set protected Ra's solar bark during its nightly journey through the underworld, when Apophis, the chaos serpent, the true enemy of existence, attacked the sun each night. It was Set who fought him, the god of chaos, fighting the greater chaos. Set was dangerous, unpredictable, violent, but he was also powerful, and sometimes power is what you need. The Egyptians did not worship a universe of pure goodness. They worshipped a universe of balance. Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order and truth, was not the absence of chaos. It was chaos and order, in proper proportion, day and night, flood and drought, life and death, Osiris and Set. Everything in its place, everything in balance. The goal of Pharaoh, the goal of every good Egyptian, was not to eliminate chaos. It was to maintain the balance, to keep Ma'at, to ensure that the scales remained level in the cosmos, as in the Hall of Two Truths, where every heart was weighed against the feather of truth and found if the life was lived well, worthy. The Egyptian gods are officially worshipped by almost no one today. The last temple to the old gods, at Philae on the Nile near Aswan, closed sometime in the 6th century AD. After that, silence. 3,000 years of worship ended. The priests gone, the rituals forgotten, the sacred language lost, hieroglyphs unreadable for 14 centuries, until the Rosetta Stone allowed their decipherment in the 19th century. And yet, the gods are not gone, not entirely. Osiris became, in some scholarly views, one of the inspirations for resurrection stories that echoed through the Mediterranean world. Isis, with her child Horus in her arms, became one of the most copied images in religious art, her form influencing depictions of the Madonna and Child. In the Christian tradition, the very concept of the afterlife, of judgment after death, of weighing deeds against the divine standard, ran from Egyptian theology into Greek philosophy, into the great Abrahamic traditions that shaped half the world. Egypt's gods were not replaced. They were absorbed, transformed. The way Osiris was transformed, the way Egypt itself was transformed, always becoming something new, while remaining, in the deepest places, what it always was. Our ace sails west tonight, descending below the horizon, with the last light of day, into the underworld, into the 12 hours of darkness, where Apophis waits, as he always waits, coiled and patient, in the dark. But Set is there too, and Isis, and all the gods of Egypt, sailing together through the dark in Ra's bark, carrying the light through the night, so that morning can come again, so that Egypt can wake again, so that the Nile can flow, and the crops can grow, and the scales can be balanced, and the heart can be weighed and found worthy. The gods are working tonight, as they have always worked, as they will always work, in the deep machinery of a universe that runs on balance, on the eternal alternation of darkness and light, of sleeping and waking, of this night, and the morning that follows it. Sleep now. The gods have this. The ancient Egyptians were not afraid of death. They were fascinated by it, obsessed with it. Not in a morbid way. Not the way a culture in despair thinks about death, but in the way that people who genuinely believe in something think about the door that leads to it. Death, for the Egyptians, was the most important event in a person's life. Not birth, not marriage, not achievement. Death. Because death was the beginning of the part that lasted, the part that mattered. Everything that happened before death was preparation. The tomb was more important than the house. The funeral was more important than the wedding. The afterlife was more important than the life. This sounds strange to modern ears, but consider what it means in practice. It means that every Egyptian, from the greatest pharaoh to the humblest farmer, spent their life preparing for something they absolutely believed was coming. Something better, something permanent, something worth preparing for. Death was not the enemy. Death was the destination. To reach the afterlife, the body had to survive. This was the foundation of everything. The Egyptians had observed what happened to bodies buried in the desert sand. The dry heat preserved them naturally, accidentally, perfectly. Bodies thousands of years old, pulled from the sand, skin intact, hair intact, features recognizable. The desert was a natural mummifier, and the Egyptians, practical, observant, endlessly curious people, noticed and asked the question that practical people always ask when they notice something useful. Can we do this deliberately? Can we control this process? Can we ensure that the body survives? Not by accident, but by design. The answer, developed over centuries of experimentation and refinement, was yes. The process they developed, mummification, was one of the most sophisticated preservation techniques in the ancient world. And it worked. 3,000-year-old mummies lie in museums today, their features intact, their hair preserved, their skin still covering their bones, because Egyptian embalmers knew exactly what they were doing. The mummification process took 70 days. 70. The same number of days as the period of mourning, the same number of days that the star Sirius, associated with Isis, was absent from the night sky each year before its brilliant return. 70 was a sacred number, and the process was as sacred as the number. It began with washing the body, purified with Nile water and natron, a naturally occurring salt found in dry lake beds. Then, the removal of organs. The brain first, extracted through the nose, using a long hook tool. A process that sounds brutal, and probably was. The brain was discarded. The Egyptians did not believe the brain was important. Thinking happened in the heart. Feeling happened in the heart. The soul lived in the heart. The brain was just filler. The organs that mattered, the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver, were removed through an incision in the left side, preserved separately, wrapped in linen, and placed in 4 containers, canopic jars, each one guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus, each one responsible for a different organ. The heart stayed in the body. It would be needed for the weighing. Then came natron. The body was packed, inside and out, with dry natron salt, and left for 40 days in a clean, dry room, away from moisture, away from decay. The natron drew out every drop of moisture from the tissues, desiccating the body completely, leaving behind something that would not rot, could not rot, because rot requires moisture, and moisture was gone. After 40 days, the natron was removed. The body was washed again, rubbed with oils and resins, cedar oil, juniper oil, myrrh to restore flexibility to the skin and add fragrance to what had become, in the drying process, something less than living. Then the wrapping began. Hundreds of meters of linen, arms wrapped individually, fingers wrapped individually, toes wrapped individually, amulets placed between the layers, protective symbols, the scarab beetle over the heart, the eye of Horus, the jed pillar of stability, each amulet accompanied by a spell from the Book of the Dead, recited by priests as the wrapping continued. The wrapping could take 15 days, layer after layer after layer, until the body was entirely encased in white, ready. The Book of the Dead was not a single book. It was a collection of spells, a guide to the afterlife that evolved over 2,000 years of Egyptian history, a manual for the dead, instructions for navigating the dangers of the underworld, spells for opening locked doors, passwords for passing guardians, prayers for successful judgment. The most important spell, spell 125, was the negative confession, spoken before Osiris and the 42 judges of the Hall of Two Truths, a list of things the dead person had not done. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not lied. I have not been angry without cause. I have not caused suffering. I have not acted with arrogance. 42 denials. And then the heart was weighed against the feather of Maat. If the life matched the confession, if the denials were true, the heart was light, and Osiris gestured toward the field of reeds, and the soul went home. The field of reeds, Aru, was not a vague paradise of clouds and light. The Egyptians were too practical for vague. The field of reeds was Egypt, a perfect Egypt, the same river, the same fields, the same blue sky, but without the suffering, without drought, without disease, without the grief of watching people you love grow old and die. You would still work. The Egyptians did not imagine an afterlife of idleness, but the work would be satisfying and productive. The crops would always grow. The Nile would always flood at exactly the right level. Never too much, never too little. Your family would be there. Those who had died before you. Those who would die after. Eventually everyone you loved would come through that door, and you would wait for them, as they had waited for you. This was the afterlife. The Egyptians spent their lives preparing for, not a mystical realm, beyond understanding. Home. A perfect, permanent, eternal version of home, where everything was right, where nothing was lost, where the heart was light, and the feather balanced. And Osiris smiled, and said, "Welcome. You have earned this. Come in." Not everyone could afford full mummification, The elaborate 70-day process. The canopic jars. The Book of the Dead. The painted coffins. The tomb goods. Cost money. A lot of money. For pharaohs and nobles. No expense was spared. The royal mummies found in the Valley of the Kings represent the pinnacle of the embalmer's art, preserved with extraordinary care, wrapped in the finest linen, surrounded by everything they might need in eternity. For ordinary Egyptians, simpler methods were used. A less elaborate embalming, a painted wooden coffin, instead of nested gilded ones, a few basic grave goods, some food, some tools, a simple version of the Book of the Dead, if they could afford even that. For the very poor, burial in the desert sand, which, as the Egyptians had observed centuries before, preserved perfectly on its own. The rich and the poor were separated in life, but in death, the desert made them equal, all of them preserved, all of them waiting, all of them hoping, in their different ways, with their different provisions, that the heart would balance, that Osiris would be merciful, that the field of reeds was real and waiting for all of them. The tombs were built to last forever, because they were meant to. The tomb was not just a burial place, it was a home for eternity. The walls were covered in paintings, not decorations, not art for art's sake, but instructions, provisions, magic. Paintings of food meant the dead would never go hungry. Paintings of servants meant the dead would never lack for help. Paintings of the deceased enjoying life, hunting, feasting, playing with their children, meant those pleasures would continue in the afterlife. The paintings were not representations of memory, they were reality, created through the act of painting, called into existence by the artist's hand and the priest's spell. This is why tomb paintings were made with such care. Every figure perfectly proportioned, every detail accurate, every color vibrant, because these things would sustain the dead person through eternity. They had to be right. They had to be perfect, because perfection, in Egyptian thought, was the only thing that lasted, and the dead deserved nothing less than perfection. They had a long time ahead of them. The shabti, small figurines, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, placed in the tomb, each one a miniature servant, inscribed with a spell that would animate them in the afterlife to do the work the dead person was called upon to do, because even in the field of reeds, even in paradise, there was maintenance work. The irrigation canals needed clearing, the fields needed plowing, the grain needed harvesting, and the spell on each shabdi said, "When I am called to do any work in the afterlife, you shall say, 'Here I am.'" The shabdi would answer. The shabdi would do the work. The dead person could rest. Archaeologists have found tombs containing 401 shabtis, one for each day of the year, plus 36 overseers, one for each group of 10 workers, an entire workforce, organized, hierarchical, ready for eternity. The Egyptians brought their administrative genius into the afterlife. Of course they did. Some habits are too useful to die. The mummies of ancient Egypt now lie in museums across the world. In Cairo, the greatest collection, including the mummies of the most powerful pharaohs who ever lived. Ramesses II is there. His mummy arrived in Paris in 1976 for conservation work, and was met at the airport with full military honors, a head of state, because under French law, a pharaoh was still a pharaoh, still deserving of respect. The mummy of a man who died 3,000 years ago, welcomed in a modern airport, with soldiers presenting arms. He would have expected nothing less. In London, British Museum, mummies that have been in Britain for 2 centuries, far from the Nile, far from the desert air that preserved them, in New York, in Berlin, in Turin, everywhere, ancient Egyptians, lying in their cases, under climate control, and carefully managed lighting, a long way from the field of reeds, a long way from home, but still here, still intact, still recognizable, still in their preserved, silent, 3,000-year-old way. Present. The embalmers did their job well. The bodies survived. Whether the souls found their field of reeds, whether the hearts balanced, whether Osiris smiled, that we cannot know, but we can look at those ancient faces, preserved by salt and linen and belief, and wonder, and hope, that somewhere the scales balanced, and the door opened, and they went home. The embalmers are long gone, the temples where they worked, the Wabbit, the pure place, are dust, the spells they recited, over wrapped bodies, in the lamplight, spoken by priests who have themselves been dust for millennia, are silent now, but the work they did endures. In the museums, in the desert tombs, in the dry air of the Valley of the Kings, endures. As they believed everything essential endures. As long as the name is spoken, as long as the image survives, as long as someone remembers, we remember. Tonight, in the warm dark, between one world and the next, we remember the embalmers, and the priests, and the ordinary Egyptians, who believed hard enough in something beautiful, that they built an entire civilization around the hope of it, the hope of the heart balancing, the hope of Osiris smiling, the hope of going home. Sleep now, the field of reeds is somewhere, and the night is taking us gently in its direction. Her name has survived 2,000 years. It appears in plays, and paintings and films, and novels and poems, in 100 languages, across 100 cultures, and it always means the same thing: power, intelligence, beauty, and the particular tragedy of someone who was extraordinary in every way, and still lost. Cleopatra VII Philopator, the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was not the first. Cleopatra, there had been 6 before her. She was not the only powerful woman in the line of the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great's death. But she was the last, and in being last, she became somehow everything. The final chapter of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, written by a woman who spoke 9 languages, commanded fleets, seduced 2 of the most powerful men in Roman history, and died at 39 on her own terms. The Ptolemies were Greek. This is the first thing to understand about Cleopatra. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC. He was welcomed as a liberator, a pharaoh, a god. When he died 9 years later, his empire was divided. Among his generals, Egypt went to Ptolemy, and Ptolemy's descendants ruled Egypt for 3 centuries as pharaohs, wearing the double crown, worshipping Egyptian gods, being depicted in the traditional Egyptian style on temple walls, but speaking Greek, running a Greek court, marrying their own siblings, as Egyptian pharaohs had done, to keep the bloodline pure. For 11 generations, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt as Greek pharaohs, and for 10 of those generations, not one of them bothered to learn Egyptian. They ruled through translators, governed a country whose language they could not speak. Cleopatra was different. She learned Egyptian. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to speak the language of the people she governed. She also spoke Ethiopian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Parthian, Latin, and Greek. 9 languages. This was not coincidence. This was policy. This was strategy. A ruler who speaks your language is a ruler who sees you. Egypt loved her for it. She was 18 years old when she became queen, joint ruler with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy 13, as Egyptian tradition required. 2 siblings on the throne. 2 children, essentially. Though Cleopatra was already anything but a child, she had been educated by the finest minds in Alexandria, the greatest city of the ancient world, home of the Library of Alexandria, the Mount Sion, the Pharaohs lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, standing at the harbor entrance, its light visible 30 miles out to sea. Alexandria was where the ancient world came to think. Mathematicians, astronomers, philosophers, physicians, poets, all of them drawn to the city that Cleopatra grew up in, all of them part of the education that made her what she became. She was not simply beautiful. The ancient sources actually say relatively little about her appearance. What they say, what even her enemies admitted, was that she was magnetic, that her voice was music, that her conversation was the most captivating thing they had ever experienced, that to be in her presence was to feel that you were the only person in the world. Power of that kind does not come from a mirror, it comes from a mind. The early years of her reign were not peaceful. Her brother's advisors, older men who preferred a 10-year-old they could control to an 18-year-old who could not be controlled, moved against her. Within 3 years of coming to the throne, Cleopatra was deposed, exiled, driven from her own kingdom by her own brother's court. She retreated to Syria, gathered an army, prepared to fight her way back. And then Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. He came pursuing Pompey, his defeated rival, who had fled to Egypt after losing the civil war. He arrived too late. Pompey had already been murdered on the beach at Alexandria, killed by Ptolemy Xi's advisors, who thought this would please Caesar. It did not. Caesar wept. And then, establishing himself in the royal palace at Alexandria, he sent for both siblings to present their cases. Cleopatra needed to see Caesar alone. Her brother's men controlled the harbor. The palace was guarded. Getting to Caesar meant getting past people who wanted her dead. And so she did something that has been told and retold. For 2,000 years, she had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled inside a carpet or a sack of cloth, and delivered to Caesar's feet. When the bundle was unrolled, there she was, 21 years old, Queen of Egypt, looking up at the most powerful man in the world. Caesar was 52. He never stood a chance. What happened between Caesar and Cleopatra was not simply romance. It was alliance. Cleopatra needed Caesar's military support to reclaim her throne. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth, its grain, its gold, to fund his ambitions in Rome. They needed each other, but they also, by all accounts, genuinely wanted each other. Caesar had known many women. He had never met one like this. A queen who could discuss philosophy and military strategy with equal ease, who spoke his language as well as he did, who looked at the most powerful man in Rome and was not intimidated, who looked at him as an equal, because she was. Together they sailed the Nile, a famous voyage, months long, on a great royal barge. Cleopatra showing Caesar the country she ruled, the temples, the pyramids, the ancient tombs of pharaohs 3,000 years dead. Egypt impressing Rome, Cleopatra impressing Caesar. She gave him a son, Caesar Ion, little Caesar, the child of the most powerful man in Rome, and the most powerful woman in the ancient world, a child who was heir to everything. For a while, Caesar returned to Rome, was assassinated, and Cleopatra, with a young son and a precarious throne, watched the Roman world tear itself apart over who would fill the space Caesar had left. Two men emerged: Octavian, Caesar's heir, cold, calculating, patient, and Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, passionate, impulsive, magnificent. The Roman world was divided between them. Antony took the east and summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, to answer charges that she had supported his enemies. The summons was a power move. Cleopatra's response was a masterpiece. She arrived on a golden barge, sails of purple silk, silver oars that moved to the sound of flutes. She reclined under a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Aphrodite, surrounded by boys dressed as cupids, women dressed as sea nymphs. The whole harbor of Tarsus turned out to watch. The market emptied, the streets emptied. The very soldiers meant to escort her to Antony abandoned their posts to watch. By the time she arrived, Antony was sitting alone in his tribunal. Everyone else had gone to see the queen. She had made him come to her. He arrived. He never quite recovered. Antony and Cleopatra, for 10 years, from their meeting at Tarsus to their deaths in Alexandria, they were the most famous couple in the world. He gave her territories. She gave him the resources of Egypt, the richest kingdom in the ancient world, to fund his campaigns. They had children together, twins and then a third. They ruled the Eastern Empire together. Antony as Roman general, Cleopatra as Queen of Queens, her son Caesar Ion, acknowledged as the heir of Caesar himself. It was a vision of something new, East and West combined, Rome and Egypt merged. A new kind of empire, centered not on Rome, but on Alexandria. In Rome, Octavian watched, and worked, and waited. He understood something Antony had forgotten, that the Roman people would not accept an empire that bowed to an Egyptian queen. He turned Roman opinion against them, against her especially. Cleopatra the seductress, Cleopatra the Eastern temptress, who had stolen Rome's hero, Cleopatra who wanted to rule the world. The propaganda was masterful, and it worked. The end came at sea. The Battle of Actium, 31 BC. Octavian's fleet against Antony and Cleopatra's. The reasons for what happened next are debated by historians still. Cleopatra's ships broke from the battle, sailed south toward Egypt. Antony followed her, abandoned the battle, abandoned his fleet, abandoned his army, for the woman he loved, or perhaps in a strategic retreat, or perhaps because he already knew the battle was lost. The reasons don't matter. The result does. Octavian won, and turned his fleet toward Egypt. Antony's armies deserted, one by one, then all at once, to the winning side, because armies follow winners, and Antony was clearly no longer one. In Alexandria, Antony received false news that Cleopatra was dead. He fell on his sword, was carried to her, still alive barely, and died in her arms, in the mausoleum she had been preparing for what she already knew was coming. Octavian entered Alexandria. He went to see Cleopatra. She was 39 years old, a widow twice over, her kingdom lost, her children's futures hanging on this conversation. They talked. What was said, we don't know. But Cleopatra understood what Octavian intended. He would take her to Rome, as a prisoner, as a trophy, as the centerpiece of his triumphal parade. The conquered queen of Egypt, displayed to the Roman crowds, who had been told for years what a threat she was. She had watched what happened to conquered queens in Roman triumphs. She had no intention of being one. She requested permission to make offerings at Antony's tomb. It was granted. She went. She said goodbye. She returned to her chambers. She had a last meal. Brought figs, the sources say, in a basket. She put on her finest robes, her crown, her royal ornaments. She lay down and died. How, exactly, is still debated. The asp, the snake, hidden in the figs, or the basket, or applied by a pin, or poison she had tested and prepared for exactly this moment, because Cleopatra was too careful, too intelligent, to leave her death to chance. However it happened, when Octavian's men broke down the door, she was gone, dressed as a queen, lying as if asleep, her crown still on her head. She had chosen the only thing left to choose, the manner of her ending, and she had chosen it, like everything else she did, on her own terms. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, was reportedly furious. He had wanted her alive, for the triumph, for the spectacle, for the proof of his victory. She had denied him that. Even in death, Cleopatra won something. He gave her a royal burial beside Antony, as she had apparently requested. Their tomb has never been found. Somewhere under Modern Alexandria. Beneath 2,000 years of city, they lie together. The Roman general, who chose love over empire. The Egyptian queen, who chose death over humiliation. Together, in the dark, under a city that has forgotten they are there. Their son Caesar Ion, the child of Caesar and Cleopatra, the heir to everything, was killed by Octavian's order. Shortly after, he was 17, the last of the Ptolemies, the last of Caesar's blood, the last thread connecting the old world to the new, cut, and Egypt. 3,000 years of Egypt became a Roman province, a possession, a source of grain, administered by Roman governors, who answered to Rome. The pharaohs were gone. The last one lay in an unfound tomb, somewhere under Alexandria, still wearing her crown. 2,000 years later, her name is still known in every language, on every continent. Cleopatra. She appears in Shakespeare's plays, perhaps the greatest portrait of her in the English language, where Antony says of her, "Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety." He was talking about a character in a play, but he was also talking about something true. 2,000 years have not withered her. The centuries have not made her ordinary. She remains, in the imagination of the world, extraordinary. Not because she was beautiful, not because she had powerful lovers, but because she was, by every account, even the hostile ones, remarkable. A mind that matched any mind she encountered, a will that bent, but never broke, until she chose to break it. A queen who understood, as the ancient pharaohs understood, that death is not the end of the story, that what matters is what remains. She remains. Sleep now. The last pharaoh has earned her rest, as have we. Nothing lasts forever. The Egyptians knew this better than anyone. They had watched kingdoms rise and collapse and rise again for 3,000 years. They had seen the Nile flood and fail and flood again. They had buried pharaohs and crowned new ones and buried those too. They understood cycles, the wheel turning. What rises must fall, what falls must rise. And yet, when the end finally came, for ancient Egypt, it came not with a bang, not with a great battle, not with a catastrophic flood, or a plague or an invasion that swept everything away. It came quietly, the way most great things end, slowly, then all at once. 3,000 years of civilization, the longest continuous civilization in human history, did not crash. It dissolved into something new, into something different, into the world that came after. And understanding how and why tells us something important, not just about Egypt, but about everything that has ever been built by human hands, and everything that has ever been lost. Egypt was never truly isolated. This is easy to forget when we think of it. Surrounded by desert, protected by the sea, the Nile a highway that ran through its heart but connected it to the world. From the earliest dynasties, Egypt traded with Nubia to the south, with the Levant to the northeast, with the Mediterranean world to the north and west. And sometimes, the world came to Egypt, not to trade, but to conquer. The first great shock came around 1650 BC. A people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, from the Levant, probably a mixture of Canaanite and other peoples, moved into the Nile Delta, not in a sudden invasion. Gradually, over generations, they had been settling in northeastern Egypt, trading, living, becoming part of the fabric of the delta. And then, when they were numerous enough, they took power. For the first time in its history, Egypt was ruled by foreigners. The shock to Egyptian identity was profound. This was not supposed to happen. Egypt was the center of the world, the land the gods loved, protected by desert and sea and divine favor. And yet here were foreign kings sitting on the pharaoh's throne, wearing the double crown. Egypt spent a century learning from the experience, and then drove the Hyksos out. But the lesson remained. The world was closer than Egypt had thought, and the desert walls were not as permanent as the pyramids. The new kingdom, the age of Ramesses, of Tutankhamun, of Hatshepsut, was Egypt's response to the Hyksos shock. An empire, not just a kingdom defending its borders, but an empire pushing outward into Nubia to the south, into the Levant to the northeast, creating buffer zones, controlling trade routes, making sure that what happened with the Hyksos could never happen again. For 5 centuries, it worked. Egypt, at the height of the new kingdom, was the superpower of the ancient world. Its gold was legendary. Its grain fed the Mediterranean. Its temples were the greatest buildings on earth. Its pharaohs corresponded with kings across the region as equals, sometimes as superiors. A letter survives from a Babylonian king to Ramesses, requesting gold. In Egypt, he wrote, "Gold is like dust. One simply picks it up." He was exaggerating, but not by much. And then, around 1200 BC, everything changed. Not just for Egypt, for everyone. The Late Bronze Age collapse. It is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Around 1200 BC, in the space of perhaps 50 years, almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed. The Mycenaean Greeks, gone. The Hittites, gone. The Ugaritic civilization, gone. The Kassite Babylonians, gone. Cyprus, devastated. The Levantine cities, destroyed. One after another. Like dominoes, a dark age descended on the entire region, lasting centuries. Writing systems were lost. Trade networks collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Populations fell. What caused it? Historians debate still. Climate change, drought, earthquakes, internal rebellions, and the mysterious sea peoples, groups of migrants and raiders, their exact origins unknown, who appear in Egyptian records as terrifying waves of attackers striking coastal cities across the Mediterranean. Egypt survived, barely. Ramesses III, the last great warrior pharaoh, fought them off in massive land and sea battles that he recorded on his temple walls. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but it was wounded. The new kingdom never fully recovered. The empire shrank. The gold grew scarcer. The pharaohs grew weaker. And the world outside kept pressing in. After the New Kingdom ended, around 1070 BC, Egypt fragmented. The third intermediate period. Not one pharaoh. Many rival dynasties ruling different parts of the country. High priests of Ammonius at Thebes, powerful enough to rule Upper Egypt independently. Libyan kings in the delta. Nubian kings from the south. The 25th dynasty, who ruled all of Egypt and considered themselves the true heirs of the pharaonic tradition. In some ways they were. The Nubian pharaohs built more pyramids than any Egyptian dynasty. Smaller, steeper pyramids in what is now Sudan, honoring a tradition that Egypt itself had largely abandoned. Then came the Assyrians from Mesopotamia, the greatest military power of the ancient Near East. They invaded Egypt twice, sacked Thebes, the sacred city, the city of Ammonius, the city that had been the heart of Egyptian religion for 1,000 years, and withdrew, unable to hold the Nile Valley permanently, but leaving Egypt shaken, humiliated, looking for a way to reclaim what had been lost. The answer came from an unlikely place. The Delta, a family from Sais, the Sate dynasty, who drove out the Assyrians, reunified Egypt, and launched one last great flowering of Egyptian civilization, a renaissance of the old ways. Old art styles deliberately revived, old texts recopied, old rituals restored. Egypt looking back at its own golden age, and trying, one last time, to become it again. The Persians came in 525 BC. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, king of the greatest empire the world had yet seen. He conquered Egypt in a single campaign. The last Sate pharaoh, Psamtik III, was captured and taken to Persia. Egypt became a Persian province, a satrapy, governed by Persian administrators, taxed to fund Persian wars. The Egyptians endured it. They revolted when they could, briefly reclaiming independence several times over the next 2 centuries. But always the Persians returned. And then, in 332 BC, someone appeared at Egypt's western border, who changed everything. A young Macedonian king, 24 years old, already the conqueror of Greece and Persia, moving east with the speed of a legend, still forming around him. Alexander. The Egyptians welcomed him, threw open the gates of Memphis, offered him the double crown, acclaimed him as pharaoh, as the son of Ammonius, because anyone who defeated Persia was Egypt's friend. Alexander visited the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa, deep in the desert, and the oracle told him what he perhaps already believed. He was the son of a god. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast, named it after himself, Alexandria, and then he left and never came back. He died in Babylon 9 years later, at 32, and Egypt passed to his general Ptolemy, and 3 centuries of Greek pharaohs began, until Cleopatra, until the end. When Rome absorbed Egypt, after Cleopatra's death, the old religion did not immediately disappear. The temples kept functioning. The priests kept performing rituals. The hieroglyphs kept being carved. The mummies kept being made. Rome, as always, was remarkably tolerant of local religions, as long as you also honored Rome. Some Roman emperors went further than tolerance. They became pharaohs. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Their names appear in hieroglyphs on Egyptian temple walls, depicted in the traditional Egyptian style, as pharaohs, as sons of Re, as living gods, the Roman emperors, playing the role that Egyptian civilization required of its ruler, because Egypt was Egypt, and Egypt required a pharaoh, even if he was in Rome, even if he had never seen the Nile. The last dated hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 AD on the island of Philae, at the temple of Isis. After that, silence. The writing system that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,500 years was no longer written, no longer read, forgotten. What killed ancient Egypt? Not one thing, never one thing. A civilization that lasted 3,000 years does not fall to a single blow. It was the accumulated weight of centuries of pressure, invasions that drained resources, climate shifts that stressed the Nile, internal divisions that weakened central authority, the loss of the empire that had funded the temples, the slow decline of the priestly class that maintained the old religion, the rise of Christianity, which offered something the old Egyptian religion could not quite match: a personal relationship with the divine, available to everyone, regardless of wealth or status. And perhaps most of all, time. Simply time. 3,000 years is an extraordinarily long time for anything to last. The surprise is not that Egypt ended. The surprise is that it lasted as long as it did. That through Hyksos invasions, and Bronze Age collapses, and Assyrian sacks, and Persian conquests, and Greek pharaohs, something essentially Egyptian kept surviving, kept insisting on itself, kept carving hieroglyphs into stone, kept wrapping its dead in linen, kept painting the field of reeds on tomb walls, kept balancing the heart against the feather for 3,000 years, before finally, quietly, setting that weight down and resting. The Library of Alexandria. We cannot speak of Egypt's end without speaking of the library, the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, founded by Ptolemy I, Cleopatra's ancestor, with the stated ambition of collecting every book in the world. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were searched. Any scrolls found were confiscated. Copy returned. The copies given back. The originals kept. At its height, the library held perhaps 500,000 scrolls. Everything. Homer, Aristotle, Euclid, the plays of Sophocles, the histories of Herodotus, medical texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, works in every language of the ancient world. Most of it is gone. How it was lost is itself debated. Julius Caesar accidentally burned part of it, or a nearby warehouse. The sources disagree. Later fires, later neglect, the slow degradation of papyrus over centuries, the end of the funding that kept scholars employed. It did not burn in one great fire. It faded, the way knowledge always fades, when no one is left to read it, when the last person who understands something, dies without passing it on. That thing is gone. The hieroglyphs were forgotten. For 14 centuries. 500,000 scrolls. Gone. What we lost. When Alexandria's library faded. We will never know. Because we can't read. What no longer exists. And yet, Egypt did not disappear. It transformed. The way Osiris transformed. The way the grain transformed. Dying in the ground. To become something new. The Coptic Christians of Egypt today, the direct descendants of the ancient Egyptians, still speak a language that descends from ancient Egyptian, still use a calendar that derives from the ancient Egyptian calendar, still practice rituals whose roots reach back to the pharaonic age. The pyramids still stand. The temples at Karnak still stand. Hatshepsut's temple still stands. Abu Simbel still stands. Moved stone by stone. In the 1960s when the Aswan Dam threatened to flood it, still stands. The Nile still flows through the same valley, past the same desert, under the same stars. Modern Egyptians still live on the black soil. The Nile deposits still farm the same land their ancestors farmed 5,000 years ago. The civilization ended. Egypt did not. It never does. The wheel turns. The sun rises. The river flows. And what was planted in that black soil 3,000 years ago is still growing in ways we can see. And in ways we cannot, still growing. The last hieroglyph was carved in 394 AD on the walls of the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae. A dedication, a prayer, a few words in the sacred writing, the divine language that had recorded 3,000 years of history. The priest who carved it probably knew he was among the last. The old religion was fading. The temples were closing. The knowledge of how to read and write, the sacred script, passing out of the world. We do not know his name. We know only what he wrote. And for 14 centuries, no one could read it. The script that had spoken for 3,000 years fell silent until 1822, when a Frenchman named Champollion, using the Rosetta Stone, a decree carved in 3 languages, cracked the code, and the hieroglyphs spoke again. 3,000 years of recorded history, poetry and medicine, and astronomy and love letters, and tomb inscriptions, and royal decrees became readable again. The dead spoke. Egypt was not gone. It had just been waiting. Patient as stone. Patient as the desert. Patient as the pyramids. Standing against the horizon. For someone to remember. How to listen. We remember now. We are listening. Tonight. In the dark. Egypt speaks. And we hear it. Through 5,000 years of stone and sand and silence. We hear it. Rest now. The story of Egypt is complete. The wheel has turned. The sun will rise again over the Nile tomorrow, as it has risen every morning for 5,000 years, as it will rise long after all of us have become part of the story ourselves. Good night.